remember the aircrew meeting I called, Hanky, where we opened up with we had a bunch of test guys because guys from Edwards had been dropping our bombs.
Mhm.
And I opened the meeting with the phrase, I'm not saying you guys are a bunch of clowns. But so what we had is we had a couple test guys come in, and as you're well aware, I have a wide variety of mental issues. One of them is I hate to miss. I hate to miss. It drives me freaking nuts. I need to be on freaking target. So if I have a bomb that I think is going to be chancy, I don't think it's going to make it. The lasing situation is wrong. I don't drop it. I very rarely dropped bombs in training or combat where I said, let's see what happens. I want to be on freaking target. So we had a test pilot come out, didn't run any computer simulations, wanted to see how low he could drop laser guided bombs, how low and slow. And he goes out, he picks a bunch of flight parameters, and he just slings them. And he misses with both laser guided bombs. Now, what's important is those are laser guided bombs I could have dropped, which are now no longer available for me to drop because some guy who didn't even run the computer simulations beforehand went out and dropped them. So, anyway, that conversation started out with a bunch of clowns and ended with the O6 standing on a table and informing them that they weren't going to waste my weapons or they were going to be off the program.
Hanky, Starbaby, welcome back to 10% True. Good to see you both again.
Good to be back.
Thank you. It's good to be here as always.
Neither of you need any introduction, so I'm not going to do that. But I will just remind the listener at home that there are 3 episodes that precede this. This is a very special series on light attack, and there have been 3 other episodes that precede this with Starbaby and Hanky. So if you're tuning into this and wondering what we're talking about, then go back and listen to those 3 episodes to help this make sense and to provide some context for this conversation. And of course, if you are listening at home, please like, subscribe, share, and if you're on Spotify, if you could leave a review for the channel, that would be very much appreciated as well. I think this is one of those episodes that's going to be really, truly unique to the channel. I do try and do things that you're not going to find on other channels. That's obviously entirely down to my guests. So I'm very grateful to Hanky and Starbaby for doing this. But today's episode is Combat Dragon 3, and I don't think there's really much information out in the public domain about that at all. So without further ado then, Starbaby, tell us what is Combat Dragon 3?
Okay, so Combat Dragon 3 was actually the unofficial name for what the Air Force called the light attack experiment. And there were 2 of them. This was an outgrowth of I'm trying to get the Air Force to fly light attack. And so we ended up doing the light attack experiment in which we actually invited more aircraft. So we put out the requirements for light attack aircraft, and I wrote them all. And knowing that there were 2, maybe 3 possible applicants. There was Textron with the AT6. There was Sierra Nevada using the Embraer Super Tucano. And then there was Boeing with the OV-10X. Those were the 3 obvious ones. Boeing never showed up. The OV-10X was a bunch of PowerPoint slides that they never had any intention of executing. Eventually, we worked our way up to the Boeing vice presidential level, and they made that clear. And we put out some pretty, specific requirements, and 2 other airplanes that were credible came back in addition to the ones that I'd expected, the Super Tucano and the AT6, and they were the Textron Scorpion, which is a jet, and the Air Tractor 802U Longsword, which is the biggest single engine turboprop in the world and was a very heavily armed crop duster. So neither of those met the requirements, but the Air Force Chief of Staff said, that's great. Thanks, Starbaby, for your interest in national defense. But Colonel, your requirements don't dictate who I invite to my event. And so I think he was right at the time because he wanted to open the apertures and see what else people would bring, and they brought a lot. So the Scorpion was a jet built out of business jet parts, long, skinny, U2-like wing, internal bay, external racks. it looked like a comic book artist's idea of what you would build a light attack aircraft to look like, except that in the comic book it would have had lift fans, and in real life it did not. Actually, it was a very interesting aircraft with some good capabilities. And it was brand new, and there were only a couple of them, and we learned a lot from flying it. The Longsword was also an interesting aircraft, in that the manufacturers had grafted a mission system onto a crop duster. And I give them a hard time about their crop duster because when I hopped inside, and keeping in mind I wasn't going to fly it, it was like a throwback. It's made of bicycle parts and steel. And that might sound like I'm dissing them, but I actually think they did a very credible job of building an airplane out of bicycle parts and steel. And they had added mission systems and weapons capabilities to it. So it was definitely worth a look, but not what we were looking for. The test pilots, the actual test pilots at Holloman, they loved it. So we went through Light Attack Experiment 1. It was a success. Light Attack Experiment 2 was supposed to be Combat Dragon 3, a combat demo. And we had plans. We had the squadron picked. We had the group commander picked, much to my surprise. And we were going to go to Afghanistan. And then 6 months prior to kickoff, actually 5 months prior to kickoff, as I remember it, yet another Christmas ruined by senior officers who can't make a decision. And it became a domestic stateside event. Instead of being run by Air Combat Command and deployed forward, it was run by the Life Cycle Management Center and operated at a Holloman where the first experiment had occurred. And so that's going to bring us to where we are. So I flew both the Super Tucano and the AT-6 in Light Attack Experiment 1. I had flown both of them outside the experiment, so it was interesting to see them develop. And then Light Attack Experiment 2, I was one of the crews. We were short on Wizzos, so we had about a dozen pilots and only 7 Wizzos, which I referred to as the Wizzo bonus, because no matter what happened, that meant I was going to get more flight time. And here we are. We show up. The AT-6 shows up first. There's a pair of them. We get 1 Super Tucano, and we're going to enter an upgrade program and go and fly these aircraft in what is essentially not a fly-off. The Air Force was very specific about this. It was not a fly-off. Because if they implied that it was a fly-off, it would mean that if somebody would win the fly-off, they might have to buy it. So the Air Force was trying to hedge their bets, use funding that Congress had told them to use for the experimentation, so that they could then move on and move out, or they could ignore the whole thing. So here we are, Holloman Air Force Base.
Okay. Let's get from Hanky then a quick rundown then. And I think you're curious about this too, Starbaby, Hanky, of how you ended up in the Combat Dragon 3 world then. So the last episode, anybody listening to this will know, the last episode was Combat Dragon 2. You talked about that aeroplane behind you, OV-10G Plus, and Combat Dragon 2 going out to Iraq. How did you end up in Combat Dragon 3 then? And where does the Navy fit into this picture of light attack evaluation and experiment?
Sure, absolutely. So I'll answer that question first. So Combat Dragon 2, although it had Navy crews as the air crew executing the mission, the Navy directly did not have a lot of involvement. It was a CENTCOM sponsored experiment that just happened to have Navy guys using it or executing it based off of where we were located at the time. So when Combat Dragon 2 concluded in May of 2016, that's when we flew the OV-10s back to NASA Langley, turned over custody to them, and then basically went about some of my other jobs at the command I was working at with Navy Special Warfare. So while I was there, we would we'd be periodically asked to give an out brief on what we did for Combat Dragon 2, and that was anywhere from mostly different Pentagon offices, whether it was service specific or a joint office, where we would go up and brief the results of this. Some of the folks that we briefed were with ACC, and I can't remember which A code it was in the Pentagon. Long story short, I got to know a couple of folks who said, "Hey, we're interested in this, as we're also pursuing some not necessarily follow on to Combat Dragon 2, but light attack for the Air Force, just as Starbaby described. So as part of that, I'm geographically pretty close to Air Combat Command, which is just up at Langley Air Force Base. So I got a call from some folks up there. They said, hey, we're going to be executing this light attack experiment. We would love to pick your brain on some of the lessons that you learned from a similar deployment. So I went up there, spoke with a couple of folks, gave them as much data as I could, and then would periodically get questions about it. So as Starbaby mentioned, when the light attack, when LAE-2 turned from a combat deployment to a stateside, essentially continuation of experimentation, I was pretty actively engaged with the folks at ACC, as well as another Navy guy I know, and just sort of, like Starbaby mentioned, they were looking for Wizzos. They asked me, hey, are you available? And I asked my command if I could go to Holloman for 3 months. They said yes. And next thing you know, I was on a plane out there.
Okay. Just help me understand then, either of you or both of you, what is the timeline overall for this experiment then? Because it seems to me like, so you do an experiment, a limited, I think, operational experiment, I think you called it, Hanky, in the last episode, LOE, that takes the OV-10 out, figures out it's a good aeroplane to do, it's a good platform, good avionics system to go and do the mission that you want it to. Is it because Boeing are not going to produce any more OV-10s that then you have to go to Combat Dragon 2? If you already have a good outcome from that experiment, why is there then a Combat Dragon 3? What is driving that?
Sure. So from my perspective, with CENTCOM using it as a, initially the limited objective experiment and then the extended user evaluation, the only way that we would have continued combat operations or a sustained effort with the two OV-10s we had is if we had some sponsor in some form. CENTCOM had the funding available to do the experiment and then go to the services and say, hey, this is something that you should look into. The OV-10s, because they weren't manufactured anymore, because Boeing, wasn't interested in fielding an OV-10X, the logical follow-on choices were other aircraft that were in production. And, Starbaby's done a pretty good summary of, the two that met the requirements were going to be the A29 and the AT6. So for there to have been a continuation of the OV-10, it would have had a pretty significant logistical tail associated with it. And we would have just had to, pull airframes from all over the place. It would have been really difficult to sustain. So having something in production, I think, was a better answer for follow-on. And again, that's with the mindset of we were trying to prove a concept, not necessarily a platform for that concept.
So on the Air Combat Command side, we were trying to end up with a platform. And so the Scorpion was developmental. The 802U was developmental and didn't have ejection seats, which was an absolute requirement. And the OV-10X was a PowerPoint presentation. So it would have taken them years to turn anything into a usable system anyway. So what we had the Super Tucano, which Brazil had built for their own requirements, which the Air Force had bought for the light air support aircraft. So the Afghan LAS, the LAS, was the Super Tucano, but not the Embraer Super Tucano as we might know it. It was a significantly upgraded Super Tucano, and that work was done by Sierra Nevada. They improved the displays, they improved the software, but when they bought the Super T, they didn't know how primitive the software originally was. So the Air Force spent, and I think the number is $180 million, bringing the software up to speed for the Afghans, and they needed to do another software tranche for a US version, and this was kind of the early software punch for the US version, and Embraer did some really neat stuff that Hanky will talk about with the backseat displays technologically. The AT6 was not selected for the light air support because at the time the selection was made was around 2014. the aircraft was not in the same developmental category in terms of the mission systems went. It was still lagging. But again, I think it was a mistake. I think that the A29 got into the competition because the staff at Wright Pat didn't understand how undeveloped it was, software wise and systems wise. And the AT6 was clearly at a similar level of development, but it was much more obvious because the Air Force already flew the T6. So that's how those two came. And by 2017, 2018, when this was going together, I mean, I was on the ACC staff and I was Mr. Light Attack. That's the reason I moved from the Pentagon to the ACC staff. General Holmes wrote me and or brought me over, and he, gave me pretty free reign to try and push this project, which is why I'm also flying it. Because why wouldn't I be? And that's how you came together with these two airplanes. They look similar. They're powered by the same engine. They have significant differences in capability. And I had to pick one to fly, and I picked the AT6 largely because the Super Tucano's HOTAS in the back seat was too similar to the Strike Eagles. And so when I flew the A29, I had major negative transfer problems. And my thumb knew what to do because it was a Strike Eagle-like hand controller, and it would just do it. And instead of zooming into narrow field of view, I've now changed to shortwave infrared, changed the orientation, turned the laser designator on, or switched to the wrong radio. I mean, any one of a number of things. And I said, I cannot fly this because I'm going to look, the old guy is going to look bad enough as it is. So let's not complicate my life. So that's the reason I chose the AT6 is because it had F-16 HOTAS, and while I had to learn it, I had no negative transfer problems.
Sorry to interrupt your viewing, but if you'd like to support the channel, please do visit 10percenttrue.com and take a look at my store. You can buy polo shirts, t-shirts, stickers, patches, and even my books. And speaking of which, if you're listening to the podcast, this won't make sense, but if you're watching it, then great. The one that's being played in the background at the moment is my new book, F-15E Strike Eagle, Be Afraid of the Dark, Part 1. It's a glorious coffee table book, been professionally laid out and put together, tells the story of the Strike Eagle from 1984 to 2002. I'm taking pre-orders for it now. If you're interested in it, if you're thinking that might make a nice present for somebody, please do go ahead, visit 10percenttrue.com. Place an order. Thank you.
One more question of sort of a scene-setting nature before we then talk about the airplanes and your experience with them. So, the light support program that you talked about. So, Afghanistan got the airplane, the Lebanese I think got the airplane, and it went to someone else. I should know who it is, but I don't know who it is. But three foreign customers bought the airplane. Starbaby, you said you had flown 86 and A29 prior to Combat Dragon 3. Were you part of then that light support aircraft evaluation as well, or
sort of? So when General Ray went to Afghanistan, I kind of got dragged into it. So remember, in 2010, I wrote the plan for light attack for the Air Force, and that was for the Afghan. Actually, at the time, the Afghan National Army Air Corps became the Afghan Air Force. And so when we started buying those airplanes, the implementation of the training plan, General Ray asked ACC for help, and that jumped in. Actually, come to think of it, General Ray was at ACC, so he asked me for help to get the job done, and that's how I got into the last program with respect to the training, what they were going to do with it, what we could expect. And so I ended up helping with that and reworking and working deployment plans. But the actual program was more life cycle management center than it was Air Combat Command, because it's definitely not our job to provide an aircraft system as part of a foreign military sales process. And yes, Lebanon got it, and I think Burkina Faso is the other US A29 user, but that could be that the Embraer sold those directly, so I'm not entirely sure. And so, yes, it was obvious that there was some utility. The 6th Special Operations Squadron, Combat Aviation Advisory in Florida at Eglin, they wanted a capability to train light attack and a fly light attack. And so when I had flown these airplanes, I had flown the AT6. I did the backseat evaluation as part of the GUARD test program, I think in 2012-ish. And then I went down to the 81st Fighter Squadron. My old Germany Weasel Squadron is now the 81st at Moody Air Force Base, flying A-29s. And I walk in and I see my name tag up on the bar. So I flew with the instructors there to get a look at the Afghan software version. And then I had done some investigatory work in Afghanistan, I think in the 2014 timeframe, on how that was shaping out. Maybe later. But yes, another one of my trips to Afghanistan, running around, taking notes and writing reports that make senior officers uncomfortable and angry.
How do we want to do this then? Do we want to, so do we, Hanky, do we want to start by you talking about A29, then Starbaby talks about 86, and we'll do a sort of effectively a quick briefing and then a comparison? Do you want to just sort of have me ask questions and then you answer them? How do you want to go through the process then of describing these two airplanes and the experiment, the evaluation of those two airplanes, or platforms is probably what I should call them?
Sure. I mean, I can give a kind of a quick description of what I recall from the A29. We went through the training. Ultimately the experiment is going to come to a pretty abrupt halt, which I'm sure we'll talk about, in the future. But there really are a lot of common. There's a lot of common things between it. So maybe Starbaby wants to talk about, a few highlights of the AT6. I can talk about, kind of a compare and contrast with the A29. And then maybe that will, jog some more questions.
Okay, sounds good to me. So the AT6 is a AT6C Wolverine at the time. When it was tested, it was called the Coyote, so I have a Coyote patch. Now it's the AT6C Wolverine. It became the AT6D. This is a significant upgrade of the T6, really the T6C trainer. So the A model trainer, the old ones are steam gauges, dials, round dial kind of cockpits. Air Force still flies those as the primary trainer. Navy flies the B model as its primary trainer, so it's a common aircraft. The Army even has a couple of test birds, much to my surprise, in a very neat black, white, and orange paint scheme. Those are T6Ds, as a matter of fact. And so it's got more horsepower. So the Air Force AT6s are derated to 900 horsepower. The T6C, which like New Zealand flies, is 1250 horsepower. This monster is a PT6A-68C delivering 1600 horsepower. Wow. It's a massive four-bladed prop engine. It's got 6 hard points under the wings, no internal guns, mounts for missile warning. The way they got a mission system was a little weird. They took the T6 system and eventually they added the KICU, the central interface computer unit, from the A10C upgrade. So that's what became the mission system. So unusually, you ended up having kind of two side-by-side systems running inside the airplane. The AT6 does it a different, or the A29 did it a different way. And so you had F-16 HOTAS because that's what the A10C had, because it was a Lockheed Martin computer. And that gave you the mission system. 6 hard points under the wing, 4 of them are plumbed for fuel. So this thing can carry 4 fuel tanks. The guns are potted, which I was suspicious about, but which worked like a champ. And then they have on the belly, they've got a ball, an MX-15 sensor ball, 15-inch ball with a bunch of cameras and lasers and stuff inside it that replaces the speed brake. So the AT6 has no speed brake because that's where the ball is. It doesn't need a speed brake because having the ball there is like having the speed brake out all the time. But you wouldn't notice that because you've got 1600 horsepower. So anyway, same ejection seats, same at the time the T6 and Air Force and Navy service had like 5 million flight hours. So it was a known, stable aircraft with some pretty decent avionics, saddle data link. So the guards situational awareness data link, again, because that came with the A10C. So that was how it was Hawker Beechcraft became Beechcraft Textron. That's how they integrated, is they basically stole the upgrades in the A10C and put it in AT6. So pretty spiffy. Hanky?
Just before Hanky, just before you dive in, I'll give you some more thinking time as well. And let me just ask a couple of questions on that then. So, you're talking about the F-16 HOTAS. Is that side mounted? Are they side controllers, or are you talking about on the stick?
Yes. Okay. So the front seat and the back seat had a traditional stick with F-16 stick grip and F-16 HOTAS. In order to avoid the complications of having to rebuild the rear cockpit with a new mission system, I had a side F-16 stick, okay, that was my hand controller. So I did not have to touch the stick to do all the HOTAS, which was one of my critiques. And I bitched loud and long about the fact that when I had originally flown the AT6 in 2012 and did the backseat evaluation, in order to do all the stuff I needed to do, I had to follow the pilot on the stick all the time. And that was not happening. So the simple and I think brilliant way was to take an additional F-16 stick grip, wire it up, stick it on the side panel. So yeah, as far as I was concerned, in the back, I had both.
Okay, so and this is, I don't want to go down a rabbit warren, but just very briefly, dual controls from both of your points of view. Is that an essential element of an aeroplane to perform this mission? Hanky, Super Hornet, Tomcat, you wouldn't have had dual controls in those. Obviously, Strike Eagle, you did, Starbaby, so, and F4 you did. So, just quickly, dual controls, thoughts?
Hell yeah.
And I'm hell no. And I think, and I honestly think it's your upbringing. So, growing up in the Tomcat, I never had to worry about, I think, oh, the stick would just get in the way or the throttles would get in the way. So having a missionized back seat, whether it was in an F-14 or an F-18, it's what I grew up on. It's what I prefer. And when I was on my last tour at VFA 106, which is the Fleet Replacement Squadron, some of the aircraft, they call them, instead of a mission configuration, they call them an FT, which is a trainer configuration where they have controls, a stick and throttle in the back seat as well. And I would get thrown in a lot of those events, and I didn't like it because it wasn't what I was used to. And just like Starbaby said, if I had to do something with the throttle, I'm following the pilot. I'm also used to keying the mic with my feet. And now I'm doing it with my hands. So at least from a missionized perspective, I'm a firm believer in, the rear cockpit not having controls. But again, I've got, 3,000 hours of that. So it's what I'm used to.
Okay, back to the 86 then, just some follow-up questions and then we'll move to A29. So, Starbaby, you did not mention helmet-mounted queuing system, helmet-mounted sight or anything. Obviously, Combat Dragon 2, Hanky talked a lot about that being a very useful tool in the airplane for the mission. Was that something that was going to follow? Did you just neglect to mention it? I genuinely don't know if you had it.
No, we didn't have it. And the reason we didn't have it is because when the requirements were written and I wrote them, I worked from what was actually available right now. And so while you could have had the Scorpion in the AT6, there was no equivalent in the A29, and we needed an apples to apples comparison versus adding something that could have been put into the A29. Okay, just hadn't been at that time because there was no customer. So we were looking for an advanced baseline, and we were not going to evaluate bells and whistles. The exception to that was the Air Force Chief of Staff, General Goldfein, had this idea that he could not be talked out of, that we were going to put AeroNet in these airplanes, which was a ATAC-based, the Android, I have no idea, tactical attack kit, something like that. Terminal awareness, who knows? We were going to put our own network that we designed that wasn't Link 16 that we could give to allies and partners. And the A29 in Colombian service already had that network. Okay, and the AT6 had saddle, but he wanted something, hey, we must be able to export this and it must be ours, and our allies and partners will sign up for the ATAC because it will give them, or for the AeroNet, and it will give them situational awareness, and they can have situational awareness with the ground because the Army's using ATAC. It was something that was mashed in because the Chief of Staff wanted it mashed in. And it actually, that fact shows up in the mishap report. is that is something we should not have been doing. So I think I would have used, and I did use that same logic for any additional bells and whistles. That's just the bell or whistle I couldn't fight off.
Okay. And so, just for anybody who's listening, so what Hanky and Starbaby now reference is that there was a fatality, an A29 fatality. I think that ended the evaluation, didn't it? But you will obviously discuss that at the appropriate point in this conversation. Okay, so Hanky, then how does the A29 compare to that 86 description? Then?
Sure. Yeah. So I will preface all this with my memory is it was about 6.5, 7 years ago. So my memory is not 100%, especially since I only flew about 25 or so hours in the aircraft. Big picture though, it's got same engine as the AT6. Starbaby, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the plane was a little bit heavier.
It was 1,000 pounds heavier.
Yeah.
But it also, in terms of both base weight and maximum takeoff weight.
Yeah. So just from talking to the AT6 guys, we were a little bit slower, climbing out, getting to altitude, those kind of things. Another major difference was the fact that the A29 had internally mounted dual 50 cal guns. So cool capability with it being integrated in the wing. We had a couple less hard points. I believe it was 2 under wing and a center line. So less hard points, but the gun, having it internally mounted, pretty smart design. My only critique of that, and where I think a pod mounted solution ultimately could have been better, is you don't need a gun on every single mission. So you're bringing those guns with you wherever you go. And that's trade space for potentially other weapons or other systems. So that would be, my only real critique of having internally mounted guns. The pod, it was the same pod, the MX-15. The integration was a little different. If my memory serves me correct, the MX-15 hand controller was the same one that I had in the OV-10, which made things easy. And generally speaking, the avionics in the A29 were a little bit more of an add-on, and they weren't as well integrated, I think, as they were in the AT6. So you could learn different systems, but it was just a little bit more cumbersome for the for HOTAS or for systems integration. But overall, it proved fairly effective on the few number of missions which we did. I think there were about 3 flights where we flew with Aeronet and were connected to basically cell phone towers in the Holloman area to transmit and receive data. And from a testing perspective, it seemed to work fine. Again, I was more focused on, hey, does it work? Can we use it in a tactical application? As Starbaby already mentioned, it sounds like there were some other, I don't know if agendas is the right word, but there was pressure to get those systems in and have us test them, not necessarily for light attack, but for things that were a priority for leadership.
Good. So this is an interesting question, and I think that relates to what you've just referenced in terms of the tightness of the avionics, the maturity of the avionics, and the mission system. Hanky, in the last episode, you talked about how you had a Garmin navigation system, for want of a better description, that was separate from the mission systems, and how that works nicely, because then you could iterate more quickly on the mission systems because it didn't interfere with the safety of flight stuff for the rest of the aeroplane. Right. With 86 and A29, then was it the same? Were those two things separated, or were they intertwined?
I'll let you talk.
Yes, the AT6 was the AT6. By the time we got to the C model trainer, it was a fully integrated system. So we did not have separation. That was all done. Now, when I say fully integrated, we still mean I still have side-by-side systems. So I've basically got one data path that goes to the T6 flight management system, and I've got a separate software pathway that goes to the mission system. So it's not like the Strike Eagle where it's all in one deal. These were two side-by-side things, and we had some, it led to some weird things, like you could not display anything on any screen. One display could only do the mission system stuff, another display could only do flight director stuff. The HUD, of course, was common. But you had to manage your screens very carefully because not all screens could do everything like they can in the Strike Eagle. The 829, the back seat, the way they had mechanized it to get around from all the software integration, that you're dealing with Brazilian software altered by Americans, and then they layered another thing on it. So the big display on the back seat of the 829 was also a computer. And so it was a PC built into a display that acted as the interface with the aircraft mission systems to make everything more difficult. Because when I flew the 829 in its Afghan configuration, just to change radios, just to change frequencies from the back seat, I had to go 7 layers deep into menus.
Wow.
But whereas by the time Hanky got to it, not only did they have the bigger display with the interface, but they were able to literally, and they did, change things overnight based on aircrew inputs.
That let me ask quickly about that radio change thing for the Afghan configuration. And that's the Afghan configuration is not the focus of this episode, but I'm curious. So the HUD has in the airplane has a little keyboard underneath it. I mean, Strike Eagle, Super Hornet, I think it's the same. You can go into the keyboard. There's little LCD panels and change the radio frequency in there. So could the pilot change the frequencies without having to go into that level of sort of software submenu, or was it only you that had to do that in the backseat?
It was only me that had to do that in the back seat. It wasn't considered a big deal because the Afghan Air Force really had no backseaters. They intended to get them eventually, but it was a struggle for them to get pilots. And like I've said before, the guys that they did get were above average by U.S. standards, but they did not have many.
Yeah, okay. Can you describe then a little bit more about the configuration of the rear cockpit, particularly then A29? So you have multiple MFDs or MCPs or whatever you want to call them, or you've got 2 big ones. What's the configuration?
Starbaby, you may have a better memory than I do on the full configuration. I remember the big display where we did the majority stuff on, a display where I was able to bring up the MX-15. But unfortunately, like, we learned several different systems. I actually went to Moody to the 81st for a couple of days, and then we went to visit Sierra Nevada, and we learned one system, then we came back, learned another system, and just due to the limited flight time, my memory's not that great. I probably have my A29 manual somewhere that I should have prepared a little bit better for it. So Starbaby may have a better recollection than I do. But I do remember the big display with the integration piece and being able to iterate on some improvements while we were out there. So I apologize for not having better recall.
That's okay. He's rifling through his collection.
Yeah.
So.
Well, it's not like I have the -1 right here, except that I do. Yeah, so eventually I'll come up with a display, but we basically had a fixed arrangement in the back seat. We did have the HUD repeater and a couple displays that I could manage, but I recall it being 3, not counting auxiliary displays. So 3 multi-function screens with auxiliary stuff for just because we had auxiliary didn't mean we didn't have both. So I had 3 screens in the middle. Okay, and then I had a little screen up above, which I seem to recall as the HUD repeater, and then some additional indications. But I'll show you next episode when we run the tapes.
Yeah. So
what shows up on the screens.
And that's another reference for anybody who's listening doesn't know what he's talking about. Here's the weapon system video from his checkout ride on the 86, and so we're going to do a dedicated episode to him running through that, Starbaby running through that, which I'm really excited about because it's very nerdy and I love nerdy stuff. So okay, tell me a little bit about. I mean, I want to understand what the evaluation process was. I want to understand what the test points were, what you were going out and looking for. But before we do that, I want to just talk at a sort of higher level, almost philosophically, if you will. The aeroplanes look very similar. They're powered by the same engine. They've got a very similar configuration. Okay, so one is 1,000 pounds lighter than the other, and that has a performance cost to it. But broadly speaking, do these 2 platforms have parity? Are they, are you looking at this before you go into this thinking it's going to be tight, or can you already on paper look at the A29 and look at the 86 and say, okay, clearly one of these has some advantages that the other doesn't? And as a sort of part two of that question, from an avionics and mission system point of view, are you looking at the way that one company's done things and thinking that's smart, and looking at the way the other company's done things and thinking I don't like that? Or are you looking at them and thinking, okay, these companies have both approached things in a smart way, and it's going to be interesting to see how the evaluation goes? Not that it's evaluation, but
we got a list of test questions, in which I'm going to plead a fairly dim memory, but we had objectives from the very beginning, and they were outcome based. It wasn't about how the company approached the problem. It was how the solution to the problem looked. And this was not developmental test, this was operational test. So the end question was basically, is this suitable for combat operations for the Department of Defense in the environment in which we envision, which was a Iraq, Afghanistan, irregular warfare kind of environment? That was the biggest. Was that whether it was suitable, whether it was appropriate. And so I thought going in that the competition was going to be much tighter than I actually think it actually was.
Okay. Did you have the same view, Hanky?
So because I never flew in the AT6, actually I did fly once based out of Oceana, but it was just a familiarization flight, and it was with a previous version of the software when compared to what the AT6 crews flew out there. So my involvement was primarily in, and I think what Starbaby was getting at, it was like, hey, the questions were, can this aircraft do close air support? Can this aircraft do forward air control? And I think the answers from a high level to both was yes. With my focus primarily being on the A29 and learning those systems and then being able to execute those missions, I only really knew what the AT6 guys said, which they all seemed pretty happy with the system. So Starbaby's definitely in a better position to do an apples to apples comparison of which they ultimately thought was better. I think to the point we got, both aircraft and all the crews, we were performing the missions that we were asked to do, and all of our data points were a resounding yes. We can do close air support, we can do armed overwatch, those types of things. Both aircraft with the right aircrew were capable of doing it. I'll turn it over to Starbaby for any of the nuances on that.
That's right. And we stacked the deck. I mean, we carefully picked the crews, keeping in mind that we didn't have available all the Wizzos that we needed. So, which is why I was kind of the sympathy hire. But with one exception, we all had combat time. We had all done the mission. We had been in the theater, and the one exception had 3,000 hours in the Viper, of which like 2,100 were instructor hours, maybe more. So I was like, okay, so you don't have combat time, you have something to bring to the table. So we had a wide mix of experience: Hogs, Strike Eagles, Vipers, Hornets, the OV-10. And one of the critical things that Hanky brought that nobody else brought to the party was AKPWS. Because we had, we were going to fire them, but none of us had fired, the laser guided kits. We just fired Hydra 70s. And so the unguided 70 millimeter rocket. Oops, sorry, F-14 time. Sorry, don't want to leave you out. And so we had a very well-focused operational test team, and we were going to look at this within the context of our own flying experience to make the judgment on the airplane, because we didn't have to pick it. The aircrew we were gonna call the shots at the end. We were gonna say, this is how it went, this is what we thought, and somebody else was gonna make a decision based on all the other data we gathered. And there was a lot of data to be gathered. So we had a training program and set up, and it was shortened. That's going to be critical. And and we were going to fly a variety of scenarios. So the entire plan, as it went out through the 3 months, we were going to be doing various missions in various scenarios to cover several iterations of everything we thought needed to be shown throughout the experiment. And, we had a limited selection of guys that were going to do nights. So guys that had night vision goggle experience were going to do nights. Hanky, you must have been a night guy.
Yeah, myself and the pilot I was crewed up with, we were basically the night FAC A crew. Just because we both had extensive goggle time, we were both FAC A qualified. So that was going to be primarily our role, I think, out there.
And so it was a tri-service team. I actually think the team was designed very well. So we had a Marine, we had a bunch of Navy, and we had Air Force, of course. But the fact that it was a joint evaluation team, and there were some growing pains, because the Navy, I think, has a much more sensible approach to aviation regulation, in which it's generally, if we don't tell you you can't do it, then you can do it. Whereas the Air Force has long since migrated from eagle to chicken, and they constrain everything that they might allow you to do in advance. And if it's not on the list of approved X, Y, or Z, then you're going to get chewed out or in trouble for doing it.
Can you remember any particular examples of where those growing pains, or how those growing pains manifested? Things that Navy guys wanted to do that you guys couldn't, or vice versa,
or that Navy guys did that were later told they couldn't do. Yeah, Enos landing from the back seat. It's ridiculous, Steve. It's a freaking trainer. It is designed, the AT6 is designed to be landed from the back seat, right? The Super Tucano, the B model, is a trainer. It's an armed trainer, but it's still a trainer. Both of these aircraft are designed to be landed from the back seat. That's where the instructor pilot sits. The instructor pilot doesn't sit in the front. My one front seat flight in an Air Force aircraft was actually the T6C. So it was a contractor aircraft, and I flew in the front, the instructor in the back. And you know what? He landed it. So initially we thought nothing of, yes, of course you can land it from the back. No. Under the Air Force instruction, whatever, you cannot land this from the back unless you are an FTU instructor pilot. So certainly Wizzos could not land from the back. So that's the big example, and it was dumb. It was dumb to have that restriction. It made no sense, and it was a restriction that technically might have existed in the Phantom and the Strike Eagle, which was widely ignored for good reasons. If you're going to have a guy with flight controls in the back, you need to teach him to land.
What about the way missions are flown and executed then? Obviously, you have this concept of jointness, which I guess means that there's standardization. If somebody on the ground is calling for close air support, it doesn't matter if it's a Navy, Marine, or Air Force aeroplane that or crew that turns up to support them. It's done broadly in the same way. Did you have, from an evaluation point of view, then differences in the way that you were going to go and execute those evaluation flights?
Well, all of our training was one program. So obviously, different aircraft, but we all went through a lot of the joint ground school together. So things that were where there were commonalities, we did all that together. The A29 guys obviously were in a different ground school than the AT6 guys. But as long, whatever airplane you were assigned to, your training was the same, whether you were Air Force, Navy, or Marine Corps. And I thought the training program was pretty robust. It was taught by contract instructors who were employed by the respective companies, so either Sierra Nevada or Textron. But it was great training. We had grade sheets just like you would as you're going through a qualification, and we had a qualification flight, which was essentially your check ride to then be able to fly without an instructor in the aircraft. So I thought the training program was very impressive. Going back a little bit to some of the Navy and Air Force differences, I was just very surprised at how often everyone was asking permission to do stuff. Because just like Starbaby alluded to, our mindset most of the time is, if it makes sense, do it, and they'll tell you if it's not allowed. Whereas the Air Force mindset's a little bit different. So a lot of head scratching on, I don't understand why we can't do this. And I think that was also compounded by the fact that we were under, organizationally, we were under a test squadron. So we had a lot of different, personalities who, I don't think agenda is the right word, but they had different focuses. So being able to distill that down to getting the training done, I think was a little tricky sometimes.
The training itself, I mean, the contractors really did a good job in building the syllabus, but it wasn't the syllabus that we planned or that we agreed on. So Toro and I had written the light attack, whatever it was going to be, the OAX training syllabus, by basically stealing the OV10, the A10 syllabus, and really the OA10 syllabus, if there had been such a thing, and removing the basic fighter maneuvers flights for this particular thing. In an actual formal training unit, we'd have put the BFM back in because it's an aircraft handling thing. So it was supposed to be 12 sorties. It was approved by Air Combat Command. We had the syllabus guys look over it. That's not what happened when we changed from a combat demo. When it got in the Life Cycle Management Center, the guys at ACC and the guys at Wright Pat got together and they shortened the program to a basic 4 rides and a check ride. And the 4 rides and a check, I said it was a bad idea. I said, this is not a good idea. This is not enough time to get people trained up in flying this airplane. And the answer was, well, you can pick more flights. So I went through 1 through 4, and then I had 4X and 4X and 4X. And I was not going to take a check ride till I was ready for a check ride, because this is a huge stressor for me. I have not flown a tactical aircraft in 18 years. I'm an 06 who has been out of the cockpit in 18 years. Because some of the guys at Air Combat Command and the Pentagon, I think, were actually not willing to put the work in to get me a full set of flight orders. I was like on invitational flight orders. So I didn't get flight paid. I didn't count towards gate months or any of that. But I went through all the same procedures, same check rides, same grade sheets and everything. But I added on rides until I was ready to go, because I was in a position where I haven't done this in a long time. And I need to make sure that I've got the rides behind me. So I think I had the longest of the training programs in terms of number of sorties, just because I wasn't going to fly till I was ready. And Hanky was up on the range for at least one of my sorties, Hanky. And I recall you commenting and listening to me on the radio and say, "Boy, that is by the book stuff." And it's by the book, because I knew no other way to do it except the book. Right, the way we did Strike Eagle cast in the 90s was not the way that people did it. They were much better and much more refined, and I had missed all of that. So yeah, I'm doing it by the book because I don't know any better.
I had not realized that. I hadn't put it together in my head that it had been that long since you'd flown the Strike Eagle. That's crazy.
Yeah,
because
I know.
So you went and flew. You went and worked with a Guard F-16 unit for a bit. I guess you didn't do much flying there.
Nope, that was a year.
Wow. Okay. So that must have been very daunting.
Yes, but fortunately, I have my ego to sustain me, so it worked all right. But in a man's got to know his limitations. I was not going to push through 4 rides and then say take a check ride. I had 7 or 8 rides until I was ready for a check ride. And these were all contractor pilots, but these were Air Force Form 8 qualification check rides done to Air Force standards.
Okay, on that note then, Hanky, your perspective then going into this, pretty much straight off the back of combat in Iraq in the OV10 G plus, does that do the opposite then? Does it mean that you kind of walk into it and you don't have to spend that much time thinking about it, or do you have to reset and say, okay, this is different, there's different airplanes, different systems, so on and so forth? How did you approach it?
Sure. So I think for me, I had a lot more recent experience with, generally speaking, close air support. So those procedures, I had, use those in multiple pointy nose deployments as well as the OV-10 deployment. So I was very familiar with the procedures, all the TTPs that were out there. So that stuff was all pretty fresh. The learning curve for me was simply learning the new aircraft. And as a Wizzo, that was primarily the systems. How can I execute my close air support procedures in this new aircraft? Luckily, having experience with the MX-15 was really helpful because I already knew how that pod worked. My steep learning curve with the MX-15 was when I started flying in the Bronco. So I think that gave me a big advantage where I already knew that, so I could then focus on understanding the A29 systems, how to integrate AeroNet, and then being able to provide the appropriate essay to the pilot as he's learning to fly a new aircraft and learn the new systems as well. So heavy learning curve on the systems, but the procedures were pretty solid just from recent experience.
Okay. Can we dive into then how these two aircraft fared in the evaluation then? I don't know, you know what the flights were, so I don't know the best way to do it. Do we talk about close air support, FAC? How do we approach the description of how they fared, how they performed?
So I'll start if that's okay, Starbaby. I'll have to sort of preempt all this with the amount of time that we flew. I had basically finished up my Form 8 check ride, and now I was crewed up with a Marine pilot who'd also passed his check ride. And we only flew for about a week together before the mishap occurred. So in that week, we flew our butts off. We were flying day missions, night missions, a lot of forward air control. We integrated with Cobras. We integrated with other aircraft, learning new ranges. I mean, it was moving pretty fast and furious. And in fact, on the day of the mishap, I was not in the squadron spaces because that was going to be our first night of urban close air support. And there was a lot of work that had to be done bureaucratically to allow AT6s and A29s to fly over an urban area, which was going to be Alamogordo. So, kind of on the cusp of urban. But that was what I was mentally prepared for. We had kind of spent that week working up for what was going to be a really big event, executing urban CAS with forward air controllers in that environment. So from the perspective of how did the aircraft fare, I only really had a week once I had my qualification to go down that process. We were supposed to be flying and evaluating for another 2 months. Up until that point, I would say very comparable. In no way was it like we would get done at the end of the day and go to the club and all the A29 guys were like, oh man, this plane is really hard to do stuff. And the AT6 guys were like, oh, it's really easy. Everybody kind of figured it out, So I don't think we ever got to a point where there was a clear case of, hey, this aircraft is more capable than this aircraft, if that makes sense.
Yeah, we never got to that point. And I mean, we were doing a lot of flying. Hanky, were you one of the weapons load crews? The air crew going to do load? Yeah. So mention that before I forget.
Sure. So I had mentioned, we discussed this briefly on the Combat Dragon 2 episode, where I think one of the really cool things about a light attack concept and the ability to forward deploy these aircraft is cross training of aircrew and maintainers. So teaching aircrew how to refuel the aircraft, teaching them how to load the gun, all of those procedures that are normally done by maintenance personnel is something that makes this concept unique. So there was a day where we all got that training. We got fueling training. We got training on how to load the gun. And the plan was moving forward, once we received that training, we were going to do a demonstration where, with minimal support, we go execute a mission, we land, we get out, we refuel, we rearm, and we go do another mission. So we never got there, but that was part of the plan.
Okay.
And so that applied to the rockets and guns. So aircrew would have done the refueling, reloaded the guns, reloaded the rockets, and they were going to be qualified to our weapons load standards. They were going to have to meet the same quality assurance standards that everybody else was going to meet, but that was going to be part of the experiment. Was the aircrews were going to get certified to load their own weapons, because of course, if you're not certified, you can't load your own weapons, and this is the Air Force. And so that was a key element of the concept. We didn't expect aircrew to load laser guided bombs, because the idea was you could drop into an Army airfield. And if you dropped into an Army airfield and most Marine Corps airfields, they were always going to have linked 50 cal. And if there's an airfield there, they are always going to have 2.75-inch rockets. They were not going to have laser guided bombs. They were not going to have jammers. The loading devices. They were not going to have ammo guys to build up your bombs for your weapons guys to load them. So, but if you dropped into a FARP, there was always going to be 70 millimeter rockets and 50 cal ammo. And that's why we were planning on training guys to do exactly that stuff. And we're going to see how quick can aircrew with minimal training turn this stuff around. You have a question.
I do, but I'm going to ask it later because, well, maybe you can talk about it now. It's up to you. But you made me think about the gun pods. You said right at the beginning the gun pods you thought were a bad idea. It turned out they were a good idea. You liked them, and then I was going to ask Hanky, because Hanky had said he didn't really use the gun in the OV10, and that there was this initiative or this idea that they would get. I think Starbaby, what you said was the GBU-39, the 250-pound payload 2.
GBU-58.
For GB58. Okay, so I had about 5 questions going on. I love that you knew that I was thinking about questions. But I don't want to interrupt the flow. So if you want, you could talk about 86 and what you thought about it and roll some of those things into it, or I can ask those questions explicitly in a little while.
Do you have notes? Are you going to lose track if we don't ask the questions?
I'm drinking beer. I mean, I may
because
not
if we don't ask a
be
question,
conscious.
I'll lose track.
No, I'll remember. It's okay.
So the gun, because you alluded to that specifically, I really like the idea of having 50 cals in the wings, not having to take up a hard point. Okay, 250 rounds of ammunition per gun. And I thought that, F4s, of course, had gun pods, right? And they were a stability problem. So I was suspicious of the gun pod. I shouldn't have been. These were Belgian 400-round, 50 caliber ammunition gun pods, and they have versions where the gun pod actually adds 4 rockets on the underneath. Okay, but we weren't flying with those. We were flying with 50 cal, 400 rounds. They were rock freaking steady. I mean, the 50 cal went where the site said the 50 cal was going to go. I found it. I had questions about how it was going to work out, but we were firing training ammunition, and we're close. So when you strafe in a fighter on a range, you have what's called the foul line. And so you can only get so close. You have to stop firing by the foul line because you are in danger because you're so high speed. If you fire past the foul line, not only are you too low and too damn close to the target, but with fragments flying, you can catch a couple. So don't strafe past the foul line. In one of these aircraft, compared to a fast jet, you don't even start strafing till you're inside a fast jet's foul line. And the 50 cal worked like a champ. Had we used combat ammunition, had we used the M211 Mark 0, the Raufoss ammunition, which is a high explosive incendiary round, these guns would have rocked.
You were firing just just lead? I don't know anything about bullets.
No, it's definitely not lead. It's steel. It's a blue tip steel round. Just it's basic training ball ammunition.
Okay. Okay. And so let me ask this question then. I understand, of course, there is utility to firing a gun at something, but just off of the back of that Combat Dragon 2 experience, I'm pretty sure Hanky you'd said to me that you had that choice before you deployed for Combat Dragon 2 whether or not it was going to be the gun that you focused on, or whether you developed this lightweight, whether or not you took this lightweight precision weapon with you, the GBU-58. Did you start thinking about that? Was that going to be part of the evaluation? Were you going to put GBU-58 or small diameter bomb or really sort of low weight class munitions onto the airplane for the evaluation as well?
Yes. Yeah. So there was a plan. A lot of planning went into it, and we had everything ordered more or less to get the Mark 81 bomb bodies with the appropriate kits. The kit is really the same as would go on a Mark 82 series or a 500-pound series bomb. All the diameters that matter are the same. So there are Mark 81s that exist. We were talking to the people who had them. We were going to get them, and the plan was to carry and then employ those as part of the training experiment. I was really excited about it because I, again, didn't have the opportunity to carry or employ those from the OV-10. And as it relates to the conversation we had about not being able to strafe in the OV-10 in combat, it's really just having options. And I think that was one of the things I liked about the AT6 was, you know, if you're in a theater where you need the gun, bring the gun. If you're in the theater where you need two guns, bring two guns. But with the A29, you were always bringing two guns everywhere you went, whether you were able to use them or not. So I just like the idea in a purpose-built aircraft to have as many options as possible. So I think the gun pods were pretty cool.
Yeah, and we had the like Hanky said, the GBU-58 takes a Mark 81 bomb body, and the Air Force had tens of thousands of these in storage. So 250-pound instead of a 500-pounder, and all you need is adapter rings. It's exactly the same hardware as for the GBU-12 and its variants on a Blue 111 or a Mark 82. So that was easy. They were built up, and we carried them. And we had one event. Remember the aircrew meeting I called, Hanky, where we opened up with, we had a bunch of test guys because guys from Edwards had been dropping our bombs. Mm-hmm. And I opened the meeting with the phrase, "I'm not saying you guys are a bunch of clowns. But." So what we had is we had a couple test guys come in, and I, as you're well aware, I have a wide variety of mental issues. One of them is I hate to miss. It drives me freaking nuts. I need to be on freaking target. So if I have a bomb that I think is going to be chancy, I don't think it's going to make it, the lasing situation is wrong, I don't drop it. I very rarely dropped bombs in training or combat where I said, let's see what happens. I want to be on freaking target. So we had a test pilot come out, didn't run any computer simulations, wanted to see how low he could drop laser-guided bombs, how low and slow. And he goes out, he picks a bunch of flight parameters, and he just slings them. And he misses with both laser-guided bombs. Now, what's important is those are laser-guided bombs I could have dropped, which are now no longer available for me to drop because some guy who didn't even run the computer simulations beforehand went out and dropped them. So anyway, that conversation started out with a bunch of clowns and ended with the 06 standing on a table and informing them that they weren't going to waste my weapons or they were going to be off the program. Which something I had no paper authority to do, but the reality is I'd have walked across the street to the test group commander and made it happen. So we had the 500-pounders, and they were not performing. Do you remember this, Hanky? Was this the same for you guys? They tended to go long.
From what I remember, the ones that we dropped, because we dropped a decent number of them. I probably dropped 12 to 14 GBU-12s. I don't remember them all being shacks. It was just it was so different from previous GBU-12 employment where we're just so slow, compared to what we're used to in fighter aircraft. So not all of them were shacks, but they were inside, the CEP of that weapon where they at least got some guidance. I don't remember specifically a lot of long misses.
Yeah, so it may have been, that we didn't have a large enough sample size let's see. Can I share?
Yeah.
Yes. All right. I've requested sharing.
Yes. Okay. I've approved it.
All right. So I'll just bring up a couple of pictures so everybody knows what we're talking about, because pictures are just better that way. All right. Are you seeing a picture?
Yeah.
So that is an A29, okay, loaded with GBU 58s. You can see the ball, you can see the wing gun sticking out above it. This is a wall-to-wall laser-guided bomb loadout. And keeping in mind that the Super Tucano could have uploaded a fuel tank on the center line with all of this stuff on it. And so that's the weapon we're talking about. You'll see that the nose, the guidance and control unit, is essentially the same, because it is the same. But we got units that were training coded. And I'm not going to dime out the manufacturer because it's not fair, but these had been discontinued from use in combat operations because they were missing long. And the contractor didn't know about it. Nobody in the weapons shops bothered to report back to the manufacturer that their bombs were missing long in combat. And until I called the guy, because I knew him, and said, dude, your bombs suck. And it was the first he'd ever heard of it. What we later traced it to is they had put a software change in the bombs to track moving targets. And the final pull was too aggressive to try and pull lead. And so what it was doing is it was pulling the bomb nose up too aggressively in the last second. And the bomb was losing the laser spot, neutralizing the wings, and slamming in long, because it was flying through. It's as if it was flying through the laser beam 10 feet above the target and not going to the laser spot. So they corrected that. But it was something that was driving me nuts, because we were seeing bombs that were still, in most cases, technically hits. I mean, they were scored as hits, but they were not going through the target. Now, the benefit of this is because the guys I'm flying with, they're all bastards. And the reason I say this is because out on the Holloman bombing range, there were a bunch of F4s. And so, of course, I have no desire to go drop laser bombs on an F4. And so, of course, all the guys I'm flying with make sure that I'm going to get F4 taskings to drop laser-guided bombs on it. And, of course, I hate to miss, right? So I guess I did my best to shift the aim point. And I can't remember whether I picked the tails or whether I was aiming for the front cockpit out of spite. Could have been both. But I was not actually hitting the Phantoms with our inert bombs because of this problem. So I've got two things. One, I'm relieved that I'm not putting a bomb through a Phantom. And two, I'm pissed off because I'm not putting a bomb through a Phantom. Yeah, so Hanky will have a completely different perspective of what it's, like to have the random, superannuated 06 in the flying organization. But, guys kept referring to this as my third or fourth war, the first one being Vietnam, which of course was not true, but nevertheless. Or, we also, Hanky, it was you that planned the Sunday morning hikes, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think initially started that. Yeah.
Yeah. So most Sundays we had the Hanky Cunningham hike of doom. Okay. Which was, let's go climb an 11,000 foot peak with a backpack on so that we have enough water to survive the experience. And we'll go do that. And this was planned most Sundays. Most guys didn't go on it because we had to wake up and be out at 8 o'clock in the morning. And after Saturday night, not everybody was ready to go at 8 o'clock in the morning. But yeah, so side issue, but I remember either Hanky or Weenie saying, hey, you're not doing too bad for an old guy. It's like, thanks.
Yeah, you kept up, no problem. And you were always prepared, which was good, because the rest of us usually were not prepared, and you were.
Yeah, I was prepared because I was a Boy Scout in New Mexico as a kid. Okay, so this was something I knew how to be prepared for, although I did step on a snake during one of the hikes.
I remember that.
and I jumped approximately 6 to 9 feet straight up while squealing like a little girl.
Yep.
Let me take you back to the flying a little bit then. So the general idea behind this is that you're flying in, I guess, what would be called a permissive environment. So you're going to be flying, there may be manpad threat, there's AAA threat, small arms threat, that kind of stuff, but you're not talking about going up against doing this in a double-digit SAM environment or something like that, right? So Hanky, when we talked last time, you talked about the missile warning system or missile approach warning system, the fact you had these kinetic flares and a good suite to protect yourself from those threats. Are you, as part of Combat Dragon 3, evaluating those systems as well then?
So we never really got to a point, or we were never on a range where we were able to evaluate that. Starbaby, do you remember if that was in the plan?
No, because we weren't sure that the A29 was going to have missile warning. The AT6 had it. This was another ancillary capability, but the reality was we're flying over New Mexico in the summer, and we're not going to be kicking out flares the vast majority of the time.
Yeah.
I mean, we did start a couple of fires on the range with rockets. So, I mean, fire warning was an issue because of the spotting charges on the rockets. So we were never going to be at a position where we set the thing on automatic. You know, we triggered it. We see how it kicks stuff out. And we didn't need to, because the Air Guard had already done that full evaluation for the missile warning system that either jet would have done in Tucson several years beforehand.
Yeah. But for what, the F-16?
F-16 and A-10, because it was AATC.
Okay. Well, on that basis, then, you mentioned right at the beginning, Starbaby, AKPWS, the laser-guided rockets. I mean, if you know something works, do you really need to evaluate it? Was that part of the plan as well? Were you going to go and shoot those things off of these two platforms? But then why? I mean, if you know they work, you've used them on
because
the
I'd never
Bronco.
shot them.
Okay.
I mean, by the time we got to the light attack experiment, the AT6, I think, had fired 2 AKPWS rounds. And we had test pilots flying the first shots at White Sands at the missile range. Yeah, so for this was a relatively unknown weapon for everybody who wasn't Hanky.
Okay. And were you going to expand the range of stores that you were going to test beyond that? I mean, was there anything else you were going to carry?
Well, so no, we went with the basics because we could get them. And so we had GBU-58s. We did have GBU-12s. Just like Hanky said, we dropped the 500-pounders because we needed to make sure that we could drop a 500-pounder and deal with the heavy wing asymmetry that was involved from that. Although that should have been done in a developmental test program, neither of these aircraft really had a developmental test program to do that in. So we were going to end up doing it. And we had test pilots flying this as part of the, part of the 586th flight test squadron. And so it was going to be laser guided bombs, rockets, laser guided rockets, dumb bombs, and guns. That was it. Now, at the time, the AT6 had some wiring that would allow Hellfire, would have allowed a JDAM, but they'd never been dropped, and they'd never really done any more than a connection check to see if they passed the bits. We weren't going to do any of that. The A29 had some interesting capabilities to use advanced weapons that we were not going to play with because those at the time were fairly well hidden, and even now I'm not going to discuss them. So the A29 could also have dropped smart weapons. And it was a totally interesting approach that the Air Force might never have signed off on, and the Navy would have said, yeah, it works. So we didn't go down that path. Okay.
So overall then, your impression, Starbaby, of 86 against the A29. I mean, I guess we're sort of leading eventually then to this conversation about the mishap, which put an end to the entire exercise. But previously, I don't know if you've said it on camera, Starbaby, but you have certainly been quite blunt about your appraisal of the A29, you know, in the form of one sentence that kind of summarizes your thoughts on the airplane. But just from you know, from the test points you were given and from the results, you said you were looking for outcome based evaluation. And from the results you saw, how did the two airplanes compare?
Okay, so I'm gonna take the test data that we got afterwards and roll it in until we're there, and go where they're both similar. Where they were both similar was in maintenance. Now, again, deck was stacked. Okay, each company brought their top maintenance guys who were retired Air Force and Navy. Okay, these guys were in their game. We were dealing with 5 or fewer maintenance hours per flight hour, which is nothing. We had a mission capable rate that approached 100%. In both cases, it was at the 95% level because we each had a case, and I don't remember now anymore, but an A29 lost a sortie, and a AT6 lost a sortie, and we credited those to maintenance factors. But to be fair, part of those were schedule factors, and that we were pushing things because we had so many sorties to do in so little time. We were pushing the timeline. And so, you know, if a jet is not as ready as they thought it would be the following morning, maintenance gets a ding, but it's really planning. But there's no category for, you know, dude planned too tight an event switch. So, you know, we did have the occasional problem, but they were not with the aircraft. It was generally with the things you were sticking on the aircraft. So they were both fuel sippers. I mean, these things practically use no fuel. And the engines were ridiculously reliable. The airframes were well maintained and in good shape. The systems were relatively well thought out, but they were still early prototypes. But they were both comparable, right? So we're in the prototyping phase, and we're all guys who are used to what we're used to. So we're going to write a long list of bitches. You know, I had my list of the top 20 things Starbaby hates about this airplane. And it doesn't matter which airplane it would have been. I'd have had my list of top 20 things I hate about it that they could have done better. Not because they weren't done, but because I could see a better way to do it. Like the AT6, I'll tell you flat out, the upfront controller was terrible. The coordinate entry system was terrible. Did a flight where, you know, we were flying with a Marine Corps Cobra and well, actually, more correctly, a Venom and a Viper. And I had a hard time just getting grid coordinates entered because it was old style. Like I was trying to enter with your original flip phone kind of style. So I diverted myself, but there were a bunch of things that the airplanes did well. And then just to give Hanky time to speak, I'm going to say, talk about the A29 and what you thought of it.
So I actually thought it was pretty well thought out. The thing that I liked was when I went to the 81st and saw what they were doing there, I was like, okay, it was very apparent that 99% of their effort had been on the front on the front seat from a mission perspective, and the back seat was really just, you know, that instructor pilot mentality, not a mission capable crew member so that you can, you know, work as a team in combat. However, then the improvements that S&C had made to that mission system, it seemed very well thought out. And once I got comfortable in the aircraft through training, I was able to integrate, you know, all that training into the procedures that we already knew. So up until my last flight, I was starting to feel very proficient. And I think that's a credit to a well thought out system where even when we came with some improvement ideas, they could iterate on that pretty quickly. So I was impressed with the system integration for what it was. I think if there had been follow-ons and a platform had been picked and you had the right team designing the software, the ergonomics, everything else, they really would have come up with something incredible.
Do you have the luxury? So the 81st were the guys doing training for the Afghans, weren't they? So Starbaby already mentioned it's his old squadron when he was flying F4Gs at Spang, but that was the mission that they had, to train the Afghan pilots up and send them back to Afghanistan. Did you have a sense for how different then the Afghan version of the aeroplane was compared to the one that you were looking at? And by which I mean it's presumably it's mostly software differences, but did you know how well developed it was from that?
Only what they taught us while we were there. So again, the baseline that we saw at the 81st, I was a little bit nervous about, like, okay, what am I going to do back here? Because it's not meched to do these things. But once we got in the seat of the A29 that SNC had more or less designed for us, I thought it was extremely user friendly. The training was very good, and I think it would have been a very good combat capable aircraft.
Okay, Stubby, what did you think of the A29? Looking across the street, what those guys were doing.
So it's not fair for me to evaluate the A29 as a combat system based on 2 flights. What I thought the sensor ball, because I actually think they had a better version of the MX-15 than the AT6 did, and they had done some neat things with the blending the sensors. I thought the sensor was freaking fantastic, even if I couldn't get it to do what I want because my fingers kept doing Strike Eagle things, and it's not a Strike Eagle. I thought it felt heavy, and the best description I got from one of the instructor pilots of the 81st was, it's lumbersome. Was the word he used, and I thought that was exactly it. I thought that the pilot vehicle interface, or more accurately, the WIZO vehicle interface, in the earlier models was terrible, but it looked good on the Sierra Nevada variant that Hanky flew. But all I got to do was play with the ground trainer, which frankly impressed the hell out of me. And the fact that they were making software changes by the next day based on aircrew requests, I said, man, I've got to get me some of that. But the AT6 didn't have it. So it's not fair for me to evaluate the A29 as a combat aircraft, but I will say, and we'll probably discuss this more as we get closer to the event, I'd say it was under-tested. Is that we expected things out of the airplane like a detailed flight manual and known spin characterizations, and an emergency procedures checklist and asymmetric stores carriage that the Brazilians had not done, and that for the Afghan last program, the Americans had not done. So, I would say heavy. But now, having said all of that, we also did takeoff and landings on a dirt strip up near Cannon. And so the A29 was designed to handle rough fields in a way the AT6 wasn't. Although when we actually evaluated them side by side, they both handled rough fields just fine. You look at the AT6, you think, oh, those teeny tiny wheels, they're going to suck. They did not suck. And I think that it largely had to do with the fact that the wing loading was fairly light and the aircraft was a little bit lighter. So anyway, A29 I thought of as heavy. I thought of it as a bruiser. And the AT6 I thought of as a fencer. And that's the way I described them for years. I did some low-level flying around to see what would happen if you get into a canyon. How much climb do I have? Because now you don't have afterburners to get you out of trouble. And so that was, I felt that it was good, although it was not as light as a T6C. Didn't feel as light as a T6C. I felt the performance was pretty good. The HOTAS was pretty good, although I had to draw out little things on my lineup card. I had little standard things to remind me on what I had to be doing for certain functions. I was getting it. The side-by-side mission computer and flight director system was a bit maddening, and the inability to display anything you wanted on any display was seriously maddening, but didn't actually affect my ability to accomplish the mission. It just meant that I couldn't do things my way, and naturally I hate that. And the flight director system drove me to tears. So every T6B student in the universe can handle this system on flying from waypoint to waypoint, and I've never dealt with a system like this. That actually has the approaches and stuff built in. I hated it, and most of the guys in the AT6 hated it too. I mean, it was maddening to the point where we get to that stage in the training, and I blew it off. And I said, we are not flying outside Holloman. I do not need to know how to transition to the high ILS at Wichita Muni. I'm not going to do any of that stuff. So I dropped it because that literally drove me to tears. If I had been trained in something that wasn't steam driven, it might have been easier for me.
Okay, so tell us then where you were at the point at which then this all comes to a head. So Hanky, you said that you were just about to go and do urban CAS. Were you in the same sort of place, Starbaby, in terms of the progression of your events?
I was going to do day urban CAS, okay, and Hanky was going to do it at night. And this is the other reason to have a Starbaby around is the reason we were doing urban CAS with the full cooperation of the police department is because I had gone in and briefed the mayor and the city council to get their approval to do it. Okay, so the police were all over this. I mean, they were acting as our OPFOR, and they were acting as our response force. And we had worked the radio issues so that we knew, and we were going to fly the first sorties on that day. And so because I'm flying day, I step into the squadron, and pretty much shortly after I step in, we get a report by radio that turns out to be Shooter, saying we have an A29 down on the range and one shoot. And that's how this ball game starts. I'm going to set the stage tactically because about a week prior, I flew with several pilots, but most of the flights I did with rotor. And I think I was a little bit ahead of Hanky in terms of sorties because we had two AT6s, one gray and one tan, and only one A29. So even though we had fewer A29 crews, I was getting more sorties. And of course, I had taken all the extra sorties to a pre-check ride so that I didn't bust a check ride in front of all these people while I'm carrying all these real aviators, as opposed to a guy who's just getting back into the cockpit. So what we had wanted to do is we wanted to attack a cave. And the question was, can we drop a laser-guided bomb pointing into a cave, turn around 180 degrees, and still laze that sucker in, lasing off the tail? Not something you could do in a Strike Eagle or a Hornet. And so we had gone up on the range to drop the bomb. We had dropped one. It hit the target. We saved it. We saved the other bomb for the cave attack because up on Centennial Range, there were a couple of target caves. And so we went through the dry run with one wing heavy asymmetry 2 or 3 times. Where we were looking at the G's, we were looking at the turn rate, we were looking at how much altitude we were going to lose. So we dry ran this before we tried several times, and then we say, okay, we're ready. And rotor up front, I was completely confident in him as a pilot. And so he goes, release the weapons. We go from an asymmetric condition to now a symmetric condition. We whip the nose around, reacquire the target with help from the INS, put the laser on, and bang, that bomb goes into the cave. So I write that up in the book. And now it looks like the crew of the Mishap A29 are going to try the same thing, only they're going to do it as a first run attack. So instead of testing it with an asymmetry and doing the delivery, they're going to do a first run attack, which means they're going from symmetry to asymmetry immediately in the laze maneuver. And as we now know, the A29 was inadequately tested in that regime. Thank you.
Yeah, I think without breaching, some of the safety investigation stuff and other things, which obviously is a consideration for both of us. I think that's a pretty accurate summary. I didn't know that they were planning on doing it. Again, this goes, hindsight being what it is. myself and the pilot I was crewed up with, we had been on our own program the whole week. We were not in lockstep with what the other 829 guys were doing. And it was one of their first flights after their Form 8 where they're flying crewed up. So I think had they socialized it a little bit more, they may have had some more opinions, some different decisions may have been made. But I didn't know that they were planning on doing that, just because I had been focused on a very different mission set. We're kind of 12 on, 12 off almost with our schedules. So this all came as news to me once we got the report of the mishap.
Right. And so the mishap report, there's an accident investigation board and a safety investigation board. The accident investigation board report is public. The safety investigation report board is not. And so, we're not going to go into gritty details on things just because we don't want to cross the line into the SIB barrier. So anybody that really feels a need to look it up can look up the accident investigation board, 22 June 1918 or 2018. 1918 was a different process.
That's when you got into the Air Force, right?
It's the Army Air Corps then. And so people want to look it up can look it up. But the aircraft, what we saw from the ground is we saw it enter a rapid descent and go down into the ground. And this was a weekend? No, a Monday?
It was a Friday.
It was a Friday.
Morning.
And so there weren't a lot of aircraft up. We had the MQ-9 training sorties because they're always up. And we had one of the test squadron was up doing something else with a C-12. The Army has a helicopter unit on for White Sands support, Blackhawks, that had a stand-down day. So there were no helicopter assets handy. And we don't know anything. The reason we know about the crash, because the 829 was flying solo, was that Shooter had cell phone reception on the range and gave us a call and told us there's an aircraft down. So we had a hard time getting knowledge. I wanted to scramble because Rotor was already in the AT-6 hangar. I was going to grab the gear and go scramble. We weren't allowed to do that. OPSO made the decision that we weren't going to scramble. We couldn't get the Army Airborne. We ended up, Enos called. So one of our Navy officers started calling everybody that might have a helicopter, and Fort Bliss, civilian helicopters. He scrambled or prepped 6 different helicopters, including the Jolly Greens out of Kirtland Air Force Base, the Air Force Rescue. The C-12 crew actually did the on-scene commander stuff, the flight test squadron of C-12. So Bulldog's flying, a guy he used to fly Weasels with. He's flying. He makes the survivor location. He establishes contact. The MQ-9s are able to establish video, but they can't communicate that information to anybody. So that's not working. And we ended up sending, I don't remember who landed first. I think it was, I do remember. It was a civilian air ambulance that landed first on a range strewn with unexploded ordnance to pick up the backseater. Big brass ones there.
Yeah, I met them at the hospital.
And transported the backseater out, and then it was the Air Force rescue crews that came in for the recovery of the pilot.
So the pilot didn't get out of the airplane. Did he attempt ejection?
Yes. And so this is in the AIB, and this is going to be one of my big beasts with the system. He is, as I recall, less than 1 second out of the envelope. So backseater gets out well within the envelope. The front seater does not. And I don't know why. So mechanically, the command selector valve was in the vertical position. Oh, sorry, wrong airplane.
Strike.
The Strike Eagle and Phantom. The ejection selection valve, which is off on the left side, was in single. I think the settings were single, dual, and solo.
Mm-hmm.
even if those names were different. They were in single, meaning each guy commands his own ejection. And so when one pulled the handles, the other wasn't going to get out. I don't know why that is, but I know of a couple things that might have contributed, because all the AT6 guys flew in dual. And A29 guys, how do you guys fly it?
We flew it in the single configuration.
So I didn't know that was happening, or I'd have tried to talk them out of it. It was reasonable for all the guys to do that, because the recommendation from Wright-Patterson is, at the time, the ejection seats are the same. And at the time, the ejection seats had been upgraded with a new sequencer that the Air Force had not tested. And so the engineers at Wright-Pat said, we haven't tested the sequencer, so we want you to be in single. And all the AT6 guys said, no, that's not how we're going to do it. We're going to be in dual. Whoever pulls the handle gets both people out, because the engineering risk was that the sequencers would misfire and you would have seat-to-seat collision during an ejection sequence. That was their logic. My logic, and that's kind of what prevailed in the AT6 side, was that most successful ejections from a two-seat aircraft are initiated by the person not in control of the aircraft, is usually the backseater. In the Navy, it's always the backseater. So from a survival standpoint, most successful ejections are backseat commanded. That's what I used as my risk assessment. But the engineering risk was the sequencer, and so they had briefed all of the aircrew to use the single position. It was just that the AT6 guys had rejected that recommendation because the risk calculation was different. That's kind of where we are. Putting A29 in the ground. The asymmetry was a contributing cause. And like everything else, you can say pilot error, because everything has pilot error in it. But I honestly think we set the pilot up for failure. I think that, as I alluded to, the training program was too short. The limits of the A29's test program in Brazil was not fully understood. The flight manual was less than it might have been and didn't cover certain flight regimes at all because they'd never been tested. And so the AT6 had the advantage at that point of 5 million T6 flight hours, and the A29 did not. And even I, who'd been working on this program at that point for a decade, did not understand the test difference between the two aircraft or the impact that would have, because I never came from a test background. Political science and history major. Hanky, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a really good summary of it. So every other aircraft I've been in, we have flown with the command select, just like you mentioned, where the wording is different depending on the platform, but we refer to the F-18 as aft initiate, where if the WISO pulls the handle, they both get out. If the pilot pulls the handle, they both get out. So I had reservations about it when it was covered in our ground school, and said that I was not comfortable with that. That if you have it available, why wouldn't you use it? And again, I've got a lot of friends in the Navy who got out because a Rio or a WISO pulled the handle and got them out. So I disagreed with the decision. I was not a stakeholder in the decision-making process. I was just one of the air crew. So I mentioned it. I was told there was a reason, and this is what we're going to do. And for lack of a better term, I shut up. I shut up and colored. So I don't want to go down too negative of a road on it. It's it was definitely a very difficult time after the fact, and there's nothing we can do to change it. But it was a concern of mine, just like Starbaby you mentioned.
And so that was the difference. We were dealing with largely, even among our own flight crews, most guys came from a single seat background. The guys in the decision train at Air Combat Command, single seat background. It was something that the backseaters, most of them knew if they'd come from a fighter background, and not everybody did. But it was obvious in hindsight. There were reasons to now question the risk management at the Life Cycle Management Center. If this had been a combat operation, it wouldn't have even been a question. So I think there's a bunch of contributing factors, but like any other mishap, it's the Swiss cheese theory. Okay, you stack up your stack of Swiss cheese, okay, and as long as those holes don't match up and there's no hole directly through your block, okay, a mishap doesn't happen. Okay, in this case, there's a hole directly through the block. The airplane through that hole, and you end up with a mishap. So no kidding, you guys can look it up. It is the Swiss cheese theory of aviation mishaps. We obviously lost a pilot. I mean, it is a significant tragedy. Of all the things, and you've asked me this previously, Steve, of all the things that I might have to have nightmares about now, aside from dropping my sidearm in the porta potty, this is the event that gives me nightmares. And, I wasn't in charge of this operation. I was kind of an attached guy. I didn't see it coming. There's nothing I can look at and say, I could have fixed this, because I couldn't have fixed it. If it had been a combat demo and I'd been the group commander, different story. But in this case, it was a whole bunch of blind spots that came together. So, and that ended the experiment. And it ended the experiment on a down note. And, shout out to Hanky, who I didn't get a retirement speech. I got a retirement letter. Okay. But Hanky, the poor bastard, stands up and says, hey, I'll be the casualty officer. And he handles the stuff that the Air Force actually did not do well in terms of dealing with the family, etc. And so that's where we ended up. We ended up with a very nicely done memorial bench on a mountaintop in New Mexico, and a navigational waypoint named after the pilot, and possibly the first joint Air Force Navy piano burning. And in my case, nightmares. So, got to find another line of questions, Steve, because we can't end this on a downer. But that's the reality of aviation, of fighter attack aviation. I mean, aviation across the board is aviation is not inherently dangerous, but to a degree even greater than the sea, it is terribly unforgiving of any carelessness, incapacity, or mistake. That's a Royal Flying Corps quote from about 1920.
You've been in 2 years by that point. Yeah.
Been flying for 2 years by that point.
I do want to make sure we don't end on a downer, and which is not to disrespect the sacrifice of the individual concerned. But before I move on to another question, which is more topical, I want to ask, though, you talked earlier about how there was a test pilot component to this. And I know you would not want to be casting aspersions or pointing fingers or anything like that. And that's not what this question is about. But I do want to understand why nobody from that community said, if you're going to be doing asymmetric testing, asymmetric load testing, then perhaps we could sit down and talk about it first. Or did they? Or did that opportunity not occur? Or were you not tightly knit enough for those conversations to happen organically? Because everybody, I mean, anybody who knows anything really about aviation knows that you need to be symmetrical. If one wing is much heavier than the other and you start maneuvering, even if it's 1.5 G, 2 G, 2.5 Gs, that's going to have an impact. I am curious just to push a little bit and understand maybe to frame it differently, did future programs like this or evaluations like this result in a tighter knit relationship between the developmental test and the operational test side of the house?
So this is the A29 was a rapid acquisition. They needed something to give the Afghans right away. And it was like I said, it was run by the Lifecycle Management Center, which, includes the test guys and their architecture, but it never went through a test program. I think there was an unstated assumption that if it was operational in the Brazilian and Colombian Air Forces, and it was, that test had been done to a greater extent than we knew it had been done. But because we were following an experimentation route and not really a test route, we never passed through any of the gates that would have put us into Edwards or China Lake or someplace where the test pilot said, dudes, where's your test data on this airplane? And we never passed through that gate. We jumped the fences. So it was a rapid acquisition, driven by initially Afghan requirements and then foreign military sales and then our own, where we missed that potential safety stops, like missing a decompression stop on a dive. We just didn't do it. That wasn't the job of the light attack experiment. So we were all focused on operational test because we thought the developmental test was adequate. And, it wasn't later that we understood. And this is one thing where I should have been clued in, but I was so far down the thought process on this that I would have relied on other people. So there was an anecdote that was told at the 81st that when Air Force pilots were evaluating the A29 in Brazil, that one of the aircraft had crashed because the test pilot put it into had suffered an ejection. So the test pilot put it into a spin with a Brazilian test pilot in the cockpit, got the spin firmly established, and the Brazilian pilot ejected. And the American pilot brought it back to base. Okay, because the spin procedure had not been tested and the emergency procedure for a spin was to eject. So I never verified that one way or another, but it was told to me repeatedly. And when we got the aircraft in the LAFGAN air support program, the weapons, you could not release them singly. It was all symmetrical. Okay, and there was a specific sequence of events. Okay, but if you were going to drop an outboard station, you were going to drop two. The inboard station, you were going to drop two. There was no provision for single weapons. And when the Air Force changed that software to allow the Afghans to employ single weapons, it never went through a test gate where somebody in the test world said, guys, the aircraft has never dropped single weapons. What about asymmetric stores? Is there a difference between the left pylon and the right pylons because of engine rotation? None of that appeared to have happened. And I didn't think about it because I'm not a test guy. All I thought about was, hey, one weapon per wing is the way to go because you just want to drop one weapon at a time. The resulting asymmetry I assumed had been tested, and I was absolutely wrong.
Okay. Can we talk a little bit about then what happened afterwards in the big picture sense? So it's recently been announced that I think it's the OA1K Sky Raider 2, I think is the new light attack platform for the special operations guys. That's what was that, sort of 5 years or so on from 5 or 6 years on from the time frame we're talking about. What's happened to get us to that point, or get the Air Force to that point where they've made that announcement?
All right. So because we had two AT6s and one A29, we just lost the A29. And the reason, by the way, we only had one A29 was because the Air Force dithered for so long on whether or not they were going to do that Embraer couldn't afford to keep one of their A29s sitting around, and they provided it to another customer. I mean, that's just the reality of a limited number of modified airplanes. So we were supposed to have 2 and 2, but it was Air Force dithering and forced us into 2 and 1. So the decision was made at Lifecycle Management Center was that now that we only had AT6s, we needed to stop because otherwise it would be unfair to continue the event. I opposed this, but this was arranged at the 4-star level. So I had nothing, there was nothing I could bring to bear. These guys immediately just retreated into their holes. And I was shocked. It was like, when have we ever terminated a test program because we lost an aircraft? An air arm can't do that. If you lose an aircraft and you lose a crew, it's a tragedy, but it shouldn't be a showstopper. You're in the aviation business. So we were supposed to have a demo in Virginia where we showed this off to a bunch of foreigners, and that was canceled because a hurricane came in, and we never got another one. So the Air Force got money and was forced to buy 2 AT-6s and 2 A-29s, which they sent to Nellis for a couple of years. They evaluated, which I've never seen any data on. And then the 2 Air Force AT-6s were donated last year to the Navy Test Pilot School, and they're flying not 90 miles from where I'm sitting. And in fact, Hanky, are you at home?
Yep.
90 miles from where he's sitting, there's 2 AT-6s in a lizard green camouflage scheme, because who thought that was a good idea? I think the Air Force ordered them in lizard green so they could never be used in combat. So they're in the old European green paint scheme. They look good, don't get me wrong. And when Special Operations Command went to do their competition, they were looking for something to replace the U-28 and add armament to that capability. And so they wanted something that was going to be long duration overhead flight, and they had a different set of requirements. And the AT-6 competed, but the reality of the AT-6 is, even when you load it up with fuel, unless you load it up with 4 tanks, you're dealing with a 4.5 hour sortie, which is great, by the way. 4.5 hours unrefueled on a little bit of gas, it's awesome. But Air Force Special Operations Command needed more endurance, so that's why they end up with the aircraft they've ended up with. There are other light attack aircraft out there now. The Koreans fly 2. One of which is a FAC aircraft and one of which is light attack. The Turks have one. There was a flash in the pan where one of the Gulf states showed up with one, but it never got past the arms show stage. So it's still a thing, but with the America's withdrawal from Iraq, there were no longer any pressures, and none of the arguments for we need more cockpits to handle the pilot shortage, and as it turns out, the Wizzo shortage, none of those gained traction. And I'm sure we'll get a deep discussion on that in episode 4 from Buck, because when we talk fleet side and so on, the Air Force still needs these aircraft in order to maintain a viable fighter attack pilot force and get out of the shortage. And there's no other way to get out of it with more cockpits, and the cheapest way to get more attack cockpits is this way. I think Navy Special Warfare would benefit from it too. But that's where we ended up. At the end of the day, General Goldfein could not get past the idea that these were turboprops, and he said it to our faces. He said, this is a turboprop. And the Air Force's view on turboprop was that it was for other people. The U.S. Air Force doesn't fly turboprops because that's a power plant for other people. Wow. It's like, are you kidding me? There's a whole efficiency zone in which you're flying close air support, in which turboprop is the way to go. There's a short field capability. Hanky demonstrated this. As much as I, decry what Combat Dragon 2 did in the terms of the overall drive to light attack, because it was a diversion, it still proved a whole lot of capabilities that the Air Force decided that they're not interested in, partly because the airplane is a turboprop. And yet, all of the guys that flew these aircraft, and when we wrote it up at the end, we all said operationally suitable and operationally effective for the missions that we expected them to do.
Wow. So did he not substantiate that beyond just saying, I can't get over the fact it's a turboprop? Did he not say, I can't get over the fact it's a turboprop, and therefore here are some limitations that it is impacted by, and so therefore...
No, it was never fact-based. And I published a lot of articles. I had to publish articles in the open press as part of my job in order to explain turboprops to Air Force officers in the efficiency zone. I mean, I was in a meeting with a 3-star test pilot who actually I really like, so I won't name him because it's probably the only stupid thing I've ever heard him say. But I was pointing it out in the briefing. I said a turboprop is more efficient in any flight regime, that we would expect to be dealing with in the 0 to 20,000 feet regime. And he looks at me and says, "You don't know that." Yes, I do know that. And in fact, the equations and the charts are available online, and they date from the 70s. The reality of the atmosphere has not changed, and the design of the turboprop has been refined. But if you're talking about efficiency and you're in a certain area, that's why you still see turboprop regional airliners. That's why people still fly Twin Otters, aside from the fact that you can go anywhere in a Twin Otter. Actually, that's the first time I actually flew an MX-15D. Before this was in a Twin Otter. But I think it was there was a sudden loss of interest. The Air Force had other bills to pay, and we could never get any traction with fact-based arguments.
But obviously, so Hanky, maybe you can chime in on the naval special warfare side of things. But obviously, Special Operations Command has seen the light in terms of using the a turboprop, because you had the U-28, the new Skyraider 2 is obviously a turboprop aircraft. I don't even know if that thing's got ejection seats actually. But anyway, they seem to like it. So that's very interesting. That's curious. What about what's the Navy perspective on that then, Hanky? Because
sure. So I think the big Navy perspective is this capability. I don't think is a high priority. When we briefed it out, again, we were Navy guys flying in a CENTCOM sponsored program. So although the Navy supported us, the Navy at the time was not interested in acquiring this capability. Going back to the OV-10s and having to give them back to NASA, one route that we went down was using them for JTAC training, because the OV-10, with 4 to 4.5 hours of on-station time with a single center line, multiple rocket pods, gun pods, et cetera, you could provide a lot of close air support training for JTACs. And we made the argument at the time that, hey, sending F-18s to do this is less efficient than having, something that can do consistent, repeatable attacks for JTAC students. There could be some value there. Ultimately, the decision was made not to pursue it. And other than that training perspective, that was really the only interest that the Navy had. I think when it comes to special operations, it was a unique situation that you had a couple of Navy guys who ended up doing this. And I do ultimately think that having it under AVSOC makes the most sense. I think the Skyraider 2, I'm glad that there is something that they're moving forward on. I do think that it highlights some cultural differences between AVSOC and TAC Air. And if I were king for a day, I think you get the best and brightest minds from AVSOC, the best and brightest minds from TAC Air, and you say, okay, let's get together and have a capability that can do everything. I think the Skyraider 2 is designed for high altitude, left-hand turns, armed overwatch. It's going to have weapons, but you're right, no ejection seats. The things that are important to that mission set are different than when you look at an ACC light attack acquisition or something with a fighter perspective going into it. What do you think on that, Starbaby?
So I think, yes, those are divergent requirements. And, so things that we at ACC, we needed to be able to do, we needed to be able to do 10-degree low angle bombs.
Right.
Which you can't do if you're super slow because your pipper depresses to down between your knees. And that's not going to happen. We needed to be able to do low angle strafe. So you get slower in a crop duster, you're not going to do low angle strafe. So you end up with a different set of requirements based on a different set of missions. The JTAC training is important. So Combat Dragon 3, when it was still a combat demo, we had the UK and the Aussies on board. Okay, so we invited the Germans, the French, the Brits, and the Aussies into Combat Dragon 3, and the Brits and the Aussies said yes. Okay, and we were going to get, obviously, top-of-the-line aviators from those guys, and when we moved it to just another experiment, both of those countries withdrew because they said we cannot afford to apply our limited number of test pilots into the Air Force basically sitting on its back and licking between the hind legs while you try and make a decision. That's my phrasing, not theirs. But that would have been a key application. I think it still is a key potential application. I think that the time for light attack is gone, not because there isn't a requirement for it, but because the Air Force has lost the bubble on what they need to maintain a credible combat force across the board and what they need to keep their fighter attack force healthy. The Navy, when we had discussions with the Navy staff and the Pentagon, their JTAC trainers, which, they wanted a squadron, but they built that squadron idea within the context of the Air Force buying more than 200. Mm-hmm. And so the Air Force, the Navy would be able to drop in with a minimal investment to make the Air Force pay the bills for flight training, the formal training unit, for the logistics enterprise. And that made perfect sense for the Navy to get into. The Marine Corps, intellectually experimented with the idea for a while. They can't get off the idea of a jump jet. So the reality was you could fly either of these airplanes off the deck of a Marine Corps, well, it's Navy, but, an amphibious assault transport, one of the flat tops. But you're flying it with only a pilot, low on fuel, and with no stores, and you're just flying it ship to shore where you would then man it and load it up. And you'd probably have gotten the airplane onto the deck in the first place with a crane. Okay, that was an intellectual exercise, but it never got anywhere because, like the Navy, the Marine Corps would have had a smaller fleet and they would have needed to buy into an Air Force purchase. I think it's one of the biggest missed opportunities that the Air Force ever passed up in my career, and the one with the longest term impact. But I entered this experience believing that if I had the best facts and the best numbers, that I would win the argument, and that's not what happened. I mean, a maintenance capable rate of 96%, are you kidding me? That's amazing. 5-hour maintenance man hours per flight, that's amazing. The ability of the aircrew to load the weapons, the number of absorbable cockpits, like when we used to have tactical air support squadrons, when the Navy used to have the light attack squadrons, so, the Black Ponies, BL4 in Vietnam. We've used this stuff before, the Air Force Sky Raiders. And in fact, the light attack experiments were deliberately designed to steal from the results back in the day when it wasn't even AVSOC then. It was the Air Commandos down in Florida evaluated the T-28 Trojan and the Sky Raider and I can't remember what the third aircraft was, and ended up selecting all three. So I think these had the potential to be great airplanes. I think that the Air Force as the lead on this missed an opportunity and dragged the other services down with them.
Okay.
From a career perspective, this was a highlight. I mean, I ended up in 2018, I had the best 06 job in the Air Force right up into the mishap. In that I was at 06 with no supervisory responsibilities, whose job was to fly an airplane and not look like an idiot. I at least got the fly like an airplane part of it done. And I was credible enough, and we'll show the tapes so people could judge exactly. Listening to me say, "Yeah, I'm a stud in the back of the AT6." Well, we're going to show the tapes, and you can evaluate that for yourselves in a later episode.
Did you get out of the Air Force immediately after that, then, Starbaby?
No, but I got out 2 years, almost to the day of the mishap.
Okay. Did you fly again then in those 2 years?
No.
Wow, that sucks.
Nope. That was it.
So you never got a Finney flight. So that asymmetric drop a bomb in the cave that morning, or
no. So we had done that a week prior, but okay. No, my flight that day was going to be a day urban cast over Alamogordo.
Okay.
So I told you in a much earlier podcast that when you fly fighters and attack aircraft, one of two things is going to happen. You're either going to take off one day knowing that it is your last flight in a military aircraft, or you're going to take off one day not knowing that it's your last flight in a military aircraft. And the not knowing part is usually catastrophic. I ended up with the yes, it was catastrophic not knowing, but the catastrophe didn't actually happen to me.
What about you, Hanky? Where did you go after that?
So I went back to my job with Navy Special Warfare for a couple, it's a pretty short period of time, just a couple of months. And then I went back to the F-18 fleet after that. So back to the F-18 fleet for another operational tour. And then I wrapped up my time at the FRS, the equivalent of an FTU, for the F-18 in Virginia Beach. So, I'll tell you, I poured, just like Starbaby did. I think he did it a little bit longer than I did. But the 4 to 5 years that I was associated with Combat Dragon 2, Light Attack Experiment, Combat Dragon 3, we really put a lot, it was guys who poured their heart and souls into a concept that they believed in. And I agree with Starbaby that ultimately I think it's a missed opportunity. There's a lot of factors that went into all of the decision making and missed opportunities that there were. But it really does kind of tug at the heartstrings when folks put in so much effort for an idea that they believed in that ultimately kept changing or kept getting pushed. And I know a lot of guys feel that way.
I mean, not everybody had exactly the same view of how the aircraft would develop in U.S. Air Force service. I mean, we still had ongoing battles even after the experiment, whether it was one seat or whether the back seat was going to be empty or not. Okay, and I attribute that to too many freaking Viper guys on the staff, but that's another story. And so, but everybody that flew it in the experiment came out of it saying, yes, this would do the job. And they also came out saying, and we would fly it. Okay, so when we're looking at Meat, for example, who has a ton of Viper hours, he's our 3,000 plus hour guy, saying, yes, I would fly this airplane if you offered me an assignment tomorrow. Guys who've been flying the fast jets and said, I would fly this airplane. Now, I understand if you're an A-10 guy, okay, and you say, oh, yeah, I can afford to go a little bit slower. But for a majority of guys who came from fast jet backgrounds of one or another to say, yes, we would fly this airplane, and yes, we would fly it in combat, I think that is a strong vote of confidence. And the guys that had done the mission in other airplanes, that were prepared to do the mission in this airplane, and had we gone to a combat demo, I think we'd have had a great team. And that's one of my major regrets, is that diversion denied us the opportunity to show how great a team that we could have been, okay, in an operational environment with these aircraft, flying in theaters that mattered.
Okay, well, I'm at my hard stop. I think I said right at the beginning that I think one of the things I try and do the channel is bring unique stories out into the open, and that is very much dependent on my guests. And having you guys who've both flown the airplanes talk about Combat Dragon 3, give us the history, tell us what happened and what happened next, has been, I think, a unique experience. I did a quick Google search for Combat Dragon 3 because, I wanted to make sure I knew something about it before we started. And there was only one search result for it. So it's something that has definitely not been that well documented. Maybe I could have dug a bit deeper. Maybe if you look hard enough, you'll find some more stuff, or maybe it's just not listed under Combat Dragon 3. But explicitly, if you go to Google and do Combat Dragon 3, there's one search result for it, and it's about 2 paragraphs. So I think we've set the record straight. We've provided some historical context, some good anecdotes around that too, and I'm very grateful to you both for being on the channel to do that. And just before I go, to let the audience know, and Starbaby, you hinted at this earlier, part 5 is going to be Buck. So Buck is a pilot who flew 86 and also was involved in the Scorpion. So he's going to come along and he's going to provide his perspective on 86 and the Scorpion. So that will be very interesting to sort of top and tail. And then part 6 will be Starbaby coming back and doing the final bookend, the right-hand bookend, with the 86 weapon system video and the checkout. So that's how it's going to flow from here, just in case anybody's interested at home, which you all will be, of course. Thanks both. Really appreciate your time. Thank you.